In 1984, the world lost one of cinema's most magnetic voices, Richard Burton, the Welsh poet who could make Shakespeare weep. The man who made Elizabeth Taylor's heart race twice over simply vanished from our screens. But what if I told you that Burton's disappearance from film wasn't about his legendary drinking, his turbulent marriages, or even his declining health? What if the real reason was far more devastating, far more human than anyone dared to admit? Tonight, we uncover the truth behind one of Hollywood's most haunting mysteries. Richard Burton didn't just act, he hypnotized. With a voice that could seduce angels and challenge gods, this miner's son from Wales transformed himself into one of cinema's most unforgettable legends. Born Richard Walter Jenkins Jr. in 1925, he emerged from the poverty-stricken valleys of South Wales like a phoenix rising from coal dust. By the 1950s, Burton had already conquered the London stage. But Hollywood beckoned with promises of immortality. His breakthrough came with My Cousin Rachel in 1952, where his intense, brooding presence commanded every frame. Critics were mesmerized. Audiences were captivated. Here was a man who could deliver Shakespearean soliloquies with the same passion he brought to intimate love scenes. But beneath the velvet voice and piercing eyes lay a complexity that would both fuel his greatest triumphs and orchestrate his ultimate downfall. Burton possessed an almost supernatural ability to inhabit his characters, to become them so completely that the line between Richard Burton and his roles began to blur. This wasn't just method acting, this was something far more dangerous. As the 1960s dawned, Burton stood at the pinnacle of his craft. He had conquered Broadway, dominated London's West End, and now Hollywood lay at his feet. Little did the world know that with each role, with each performance that left audiences breathless, Burton was slowly losing pieces of himself that he would never recover. The stage was set for a love story that would captivate the world, a partnership that would create cinematic magic, and a descent into darkness that would ultimately steal one of cinema's greatest talents from us forever. The golden voice was about to meet its match, and nothing would ever be the same. Then came Elizabeth Taylor, and the world shifted on its axis. When Burton first laid eyes on the violet-eyed goddess on the set of Cleopatra in 1962, it wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. Two tortured souls finding their reflection in each other's pain, their completion in each other's chaos. Their affair scandalized the world. Burton was married to Sybil Williams, his devoted Welsh wife, who had stood by him through his rise to fame. Taylor was wed to Eddie Fisher, though her heart still ached from the loss of Mike Todd. But when these two titans collided, conventional morality crumbled like ancient Rome. The chemistry between Burton and Taylor wasn't confined to their personal lives, ignited the screen. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf showcased their ability to tear each other apart with surgical precision, their real-life volatility bleeding into their characters. Critics called it devastating. Audiences couldn't look away. Here were two people who loved each other enough to destroy themselves publicly, repeatedly, magnificently. But what the cameras captured was only the surface. Behind the glamorous premieres and the jet-setting lifestyle, Burton was drowning. Each public display of their tumultuous relationship chipped away at something essential within him. The man who had once found solace in words, in the careful construction of character and meaning, now found himself living inside a performance he couldn't escape. Their first marriage lasted from 1964 to 1974, a decade of passionate love letters, explosive fights, reconciliations that made headlines, and separations that broke hearts around the world. They divorced, remarried in 1976, and divorced again in 1977. Each cycle left Burton more hollowed out, more desperate to find the man he had been before the world fell in love with his pain. The Elizabeth Taylor phenomenon had transformed Richard Burton from a respected actor into a global spectacle, and in the process, it had begun to devour the very essence that made him extraordinary. The stories of Richard Burton's drinking became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Tales of vodka for breakfast, of entire bottles of whiskey disappearing during lunch breaks, of performances delivered with such conviction that audiences never suspected the star was barely standing. But these stories, repeated endlessly in gossip columns and biographies, became a convenient mask for a far more complex truth. Yes, Burton drank heavily, destructively, but the drinking wasn't the cause of his problems, it was the symptom of something much deeper. Those who knew Burton intimately spoke of a man haunted by an insatiable hunger for meaning, for purpose beyond the shallow waters of celebrity. The alcohol wasn't drowning his talent, it was drowning his despair. Burton's relationship with drink began in his youth in Wales, where alcohol was woven into the fabric of working-class life. But as fame engulfed him, drinking transformed from social lubricant to emotional anesthesia. Each sip was an attempt to quiet the voice inside his head that whispered he was betraying his true calling, that he was wasting his gifts on increasingly hollow pursuits. The real tragedy wasn't that Burton drank it, was that the world chose to focus on the drinking rather than asking why such a brilliant mind needed to escape itself so desperately. Behind the bottles and the bar fights lay a man grappling with existential questions that success couldn't answer. What was the point of perfect technique if the material was meaningless? What was the value of universal acclaim if it came at the cost of personal authenticity? Those closest to Burton described moments of crystalline sobriety when the actor would speak with heartbreaking clarity about his sense of spiritual emptiness, his feeling that he had sold his soul for fame and found the transaction lacking. These weren't the ramblings of a drunk, they were the confessions of a man slowly realizing he had lost his way. The drinking stories became easier to tell than the truth, that one of the most gifted actors of his generation was dying inside, and alcohol was simply the most visible manifestation of his quiet desperation. For Richard Burton, Shakespeare wasn't just literature, it was religion. From his earliest days on the London stage, Burton approached the bard's work with an almost mystical reverence that bordered on obsession. He could recite entire plays from memory, would quote sonnets in casual conversation, and believed, with unwavering conviction, that Shakespeare held the keys to understanding the human condition. This obsession became both Burton's greatest strength and his most devastating weakness. His Hamlet, first performed in 1953 and later revived on Broadway in 1964, was transcendent. Critics described watching Burton embody the melancholy prince as a religious experience. He didn't just perform Hamlet, he became him, channeling the character's existential torment with such authenticity that audiences left theaters emotionally shattered. But something dangerous was happening. Burton's identification with Shakespeare's tragic heroes was becoming complete. He saw himself in Hamlet's paralysis, in King Lear's rage, in Macbeth's ambition-driven destruction. The line between character study and personal psychology was dissolving, and Burton was losing himself in the process. Those who worked with Burton during his later Shakespearean productions described a man possessed. He would remain in character long after curtain fall, speaking in Elizabethan cadences, brooding with theatrical intensity that seemed too real, too consuming. His dressing room became a shrine to the playwright, filled with first editions, annotated scripts, and photographs of legendary Shakespearean actors who had come before. The obsession reached its peak during his final attempt at King Lear in the early 1980s. Burton approached the role as if it were his last testament, pouring every ounce of his remaining vitality into the Mad King's journey. But instead of finding catharsis, he found only deeper despair. Lear's descent into madness felt less like acting and more like prophecy. Shakespeare had given Burton his greatest triumphs, but it was also consuming him from within, demanding a level of emotional authenticity that was slowly destroying the man behind the performances. What the world didn't know was that by the mid-1970s, Richard Burton was experiencing a profound political awakening that would fundamentally change his relationship with his craft. The Welsh valleys of his youth hadn't just given him his distinctive voice. They had instilled in him a deep sense of social justice, a working-class consciousness that decades of Hollywood luxury had temporarily buried but never truly extinguished. Burton began reading voraciously, not just scripts and Shakespeare, but political theory, social criticism, and historical accounts of workers' struggles. He corresponded with Welsh intellectuals and union leaders, sending long, passionate letters about the responsibility of artists to their communities. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a midlife crisis affectation. This was a genuine spiritual reckoning. Actor who had once been content to embody kings and lovers on screen now felt compelled to address real-world injustice. He wanted to use his platform, his voice, his influence for something more meaningful than entertainment. But Hollywood, with its careful political neutrality and profit-driven priorities, had no interest in Richard Burton, the social activist. Scripts that once would have excited him now seemed trivial, even offensive. How could he justify playing another wealthy businessman when Welsh miners were struggling for fair wages? How could he romance another leading lady when women around the world were fighting for basic rights? The comfortable numbness of celebrity lifestyle began to feel like complicity in a system he increasingly questioned. Burton attempted to channel his political passion into his work, seeking out roles that aligned with his evolving worldview, but the industry that had celebrated him as a romantic lead and classical interpreter had little patience for his transformation. Producers wanted the old Burton, the dangerous lover, the tortured artist, not the politically awakened social critic. This rejection of his authentic evolution created a crisis of purpose that would prove more devastating than any drinking problem or romantic scandal. Behind the public facade of drinking and drama lay a medical, the reality that Richard Burton's inner circle protected with fierce loyalty. Throughout the late 1970s, Burton was battling epilepsy, a condition that, in that era, carried enormous stigma and could have ended his career instantly if publicly revealed. The seizures began small, barely noticeable episodes that Burton initially dismissed as stress or exhaustion, but they gradually intensified, becoming more frequent and more severe. During film shoots, trusted assistants and close friends would create elaborate cover stories to explain Burton's occasional absences or moments of confusion. The official explanation was always the same: too much to drink the night before. What made Burton's condition particularly tragic was how it affected his relationship with language and memory the very tools of his trade. Epilepsy began stealing words from him, creating gaps in his legendary recall that had once allowed him to memorize entire scripts in a single reading. The man who could recite Shakespeare's complete works began struggling to remember simple dialogue. Burton's neurologist, Dr. James Morrison, would later reveal that the actor lived in constant fear of having a seizure during a performance or while cameras were rolling. This anxiety created a vicious cycle. Stress triggered seizures, and fear of seizures created more stress. The drinking, which everyone assumed was purely recreational or emotional, was actually Burton's attempt to self-medicate against the unpredictable episodes. The medication available for epilepsy in the 1970s was primitive and came with severe side effects. The drugs that controlled Burton's seizures also dulled his mental acuity, slowed his speech, and dampened the emotional intensity that had made him a star. He was trapped between two impossible choices: manage his condition and lose his brilliance, or maintain his artistic edge and risk public humiliation. Those closest to Burton described the heartbreaking paradox of watching a man whose greatest gift was his mind slowly losing control of that very faculty, all while maintaining the pretense that alcohol was his only demon. By 1978, an industry whisper had become an undeniable reality. Richard Burton was box office poison. The man who had once guaranteed profitable returns with his mere presence now represented financial risk. A string of commercial failures, Exorcist 2, The Heretic, The Wild Geese, Breakthrough had transformed one of cinema's most bankable stars into a cautionary tale about the dangers of self-destruction. But the label of box office poison was more than just a professional setback for Burton. It was a personal devastation that cut to the core of his identity. For an actor who had built his self-worth on audience approval and critical acclaim, the industry's rejection felt like a death sentence. The roles that were offered to him became increasingly desperate attempts by producers to capitalize on his notoriety rather than his talent. Burton found himself trapped in a spiral of artistic compromise. To pay his substantial debts and maintain his lifestyle, he accepted roles in films he privately despised. Each paycheck came with a piece of his soul. Each performance in service of inferior material felt like a betrayal of everything he had once stood for. The actor who had begun his career with such noble ambitions now found himself appearing in productions that seemed designed to mock his former greatness. The worst part wasn't the bad reviews or the empty theaters. It was the look in people's eyes when they saw him. Where once there had been excitement and admiration, Burton now saw pity and disappointment. Fans who had once worshipped his every word now whispered about his decline. Industry colleagues who had once competed for his attention now avoided him at parties. What the public didn't understand was that Burton was fully aware of his diminished status. In private moments, he would speak with devastating clarity about his fall from grace, analyzing his career choices with the same intellectual rigor he had once brought to Shakespearean roles. He knew exactly what he had lost and exactly why he had lost it, which made the loss infinitely more painful. The box office poison years weren't just about failed films, they were about a man watching his life's work become a cautionary tale while feeling powerless to change the narrative. Even after their final divorce in 1977, Elizabeth Taylor's influence over Richard Burton remained as powerful as gravity. She had become more than just an ex-wife. She was the mirror in which he saw his own destruction, the reminder of everything he had gained and lost in his pursuit of transcendent love. Their post-divorced relationship was a masterclass in beautiful toxicity. They would meet in glamorous locations around the world, spend passionate weekends together, and then part with the understanding that they were too destructive to actually live together again. These encounters left Burton emotionally devastated each time, reopening wounds that never properly healed. Taylor had moved on in ways that Burton found impossible to replicate. She had found new love with John Warner, had redirected her energy toward humanitarian causes, and had somehow maintained her status as a beloved icon despite their shared scandals. Burton watched from afar as the woman who had helped destroy his life rebuilt hers with apparent ease. Cruelest irony was that Burton's best performances during this period came when he was channeling his pain over Elizabeth. His work in Equus 1977 drew directly from his feelings of sexual and emotional confusion in the aftermath of their relationship. Critics praised his raw vulnerability, without realizing they were witnessing a man's genuine psychological breakdown transformed into art. Burton began writing obsessively about Elizabeth, not for publication, but as a form of therapy. Journals filled with passionate declarations, bitter recriminations, and desperate pleas revealed a man still completely under her spell years after their final separation. He couldn't understand how someone could love and destroy simultaneously, how the person who had brought him his greatest joy had also orchestrated his deepest misery. Friends described Burton during this period as a man haunted by a ghost who was still very much alive. Elizabeth's shadow followed him into every subsequent relationship. every professional decision, every moment of attempted happiness. She had become the standard against which every experience was measured, and nothing else would ever measure up. In 1982, Richard Burton faced a reckoning that went far beyond financial insolvency. Yes, his extravagant lifestyle and poor investments had left him nearly bankrupt in monetary terms. But the real crisis was spiritual. The man who had once possessed infinite wealth in terms of talent, respect, and possibility now found himself emotionally and artistically destitute. The financial problems were actually symptoms of a deeper malaise. Burton had spent years making decisions based on immediate gratification rather than long-term wisdom. He had chosen projects for their paychecks rather than their artistic merit, had invested in schemes that promised quick returns rather than sustainable growth, and had lived as if his earning power would remain infinite forever. But as accountants pored over his financial records, revealing the extent of his monetary crisis, Burton was conducting his own audit of his life's meaning. What had he accomplished beyond entertaining millions? What legacy would he leave beyond gossip column headlines? What wisdom had he gained from all his experiences with love, fame, and success?